It also explores some themes that fascinate me, and the strange things that happen when people think they found paradise on an island, maybe, and also the classic adventure tale that you can sometimes turn inside out these days. So without further ado, I'll read you a little bit from the book. I think because the book it's a novel in stories, in vignettes. So I'm going to read you beginnings of 3 stories, so you'll kind of get the idea of some of the atmosphere of Madagascar as translated in this book. And the first one I'm going to read you is the beginning of the first story in the book, which is called The Packet War. And it begins with a quotation from the traditional epic of Madagascar called Ibonia, which is a very ancient oral epic. I am a big house seen from afar. Not even a whole crowd can take it apart, but if they do, it takes revenge. And when those from across the sea catch sight of me, I add them to my servants. The Packet War. There are houses that you don't want that nevertheless enter your life and bring with them other lives, whole other worlds. There are countries you visit that lay hold of you and don't let go, even if you diligently attempt to remain a tourist. These thoughts have been incubating in the mind of Shea Senna ever since she, a Black American woman with scant interest in the continent of Africa, except as a near mythical motherland, unexpectedly and unwillingly became mistress of the Red House, a sprawling household in northwestern Madagascar. It is because of the big house and its bad fortune that she is at present in a dreamlike situation, hurrying under the calescent subequatorial sun through the back lanes of a fisherman's shanty town on the island of Naratrani in pursuit of a tiny Sakalava girl in a white satin gown. In the light-soaked stillness of the hottest noontime hour, when mongrel dogs lie flat as puddles in patches of shade, the barefoot child, who looks like an eerie carnival figure in that glaring dress with its flounces and ribbons, skips in and out of sight through a maze of tottering bamboo huts. Occasionally, the girl turns her little braided head and makes a cheeky beckoning motion with a spindly brown arm as she guides Shea and Shea's head housekeeper, Bertine Lagrande, to the house of the man referred to, usually in whispers, as the neighbor. The tall, stately Bertine, also barefoot, also Sakalava, leads the way. Dressed in a sweeping print lamba wrap, her geometrically knotted hair hidden by a big sun-faded newsboy hat that gives her a curiously regal air, she chuckles softly each time the small, white apparition of the child flashes into sight, then treads on casually, as if engaged in an everyday errand. Shea stumbles along in Bertine's wake, hampered by the long skirt she was told to wear, and hobbled as well by her American common sense, which is struggling with the awareness that she has crossed a threshold into the deep unknown. Her woven shoulder bag, concealing a wad of Ari bills, and the small gift that Bertine suggested bangs against her side as she tries not to think of the fact that she is seeking out the neighbor, a notorious conjure man, in hopes that he can lift the spell on her house. So that's the beginning of the first story, the entrance into the book, actually. So the story goes on to describe exactly what is going on in the house and how things began very badly with it. And and you find that out in the rest of the packet, which is a very long and complicated story. I'm going to read you next the beginning of a story called The Children, which was actually published last fall in the New Yorker, which is a little bit further into the history of the Red House. After Shea and her husband Senna have been living there for a few years. The Children. There's a quote from Moby Dick with The Children. If you touch the islands, Mr. Flask, beware of fornication.
the children. Theirs begins when Shay and her friend Justinia run into the girl Rona at the Fleur des Îles Cafe. This encounter happens one summer day in the early aughts, a time when the Senas have settled with relative serenity into the ritual of vacations at the Red House, which by now is almost 4 years old. In the same period, Naratrani is experiencing a bizarre crime wave. A maniac at large on the island is cutting off people's heads. The mysterious beheadings are not connected to the events recounted here, except to establish the lawlessness always present behind the dazzling Naratrani panorama of sugar white beaches and cobalt seas. The crimes begin to surface on a hot January morning as a French hotel manager is taking his pre-dawn constitutional stroll along Finnuana Bay and spies through a mist of sandflies something just above the tide line that looks like an unhusked coconut. It turns out to be a human head, one that was last seen on the shoulders of a part-time sweeper at the Frenchman's Hotel. In the next months, 4 more severed heads are discovered, hideously marooned near grounded pirogues, on paths through the sugarcane, and even on the rocks that are used by villagers as public toilets. The victims are all men from various Malagasy tribes, Antandroy, Tsimiheti, Sakalava, night watchmen and groundskeepers, men of so low a status that no one can be bothered to bribe the island gendarmerie into investigating their deaths. Okay, so that's the opening of another story about what happens on this so-called Paradise Island. And then I'll just read you a final one that's quite short. It's from another story that was published just recently this spring in the New Yorker, The Rivals. And it starts with a poem by a Malagasy poet, Rainavo. 2 loves grew up together, twin loves, woe on him who betrays. Farewell, dear, farewell. Foolish love plays tricks. Indecisive love drives one mad. The Rivals. When Floristella catches sight of Pianon on the Red House veranda, the side that overlooks Madame Rose's jackfruit tree, he gives a martial bellow, charges down the garden path, and attacks his neighbor with a walking stick. And though the 2 old Italian men, both well over 70, are ludicrous combatants, Floristella, a diabetic, is ponderously fat, while tall Pianon is skeletal from annual bouts of malaria, so that their skirmish suggests a clash between Falstaff and Ichabod Crane. Their energy and passion run high, and no one who witnesses the incident feels inclined to laugh. The Seners are back home in Italy at the time, but there are plenty of witnesses to give them a detailed report of the scandalous fight under their own roof, between the man who is their resident accountant, Pianon, and their old friend and next door neighbor, Floristella. There's Madame Rose, neighbor on the opposite side. There are gardeners. There are idling workmen from Floristella's construction site adjacent to the Red House. There are maids from the Red House, including the Sena's omniscient head housekeeper, Bertine Legrand. There are Antandroy market women heading up the beach. There is a herd boy driving a string of zebu up the side path from their morning bath in the sea. There is an oyster vendor in a straw pillbox hat. The maids and gardeners rush to separate the struggling old white men, while others stop and stare, but everyone shows a notable lack of astonishment. Everyone up and down Finnuana Beach, and in fact all over the island, knows the history of the trouble between the old men and the name of the girl at the bottom of it. Okay, so that story goes on to describe this rivalry between old foreign men on the island. And so that will just give you a kind of a taste of the kind of stories that are in that book, or collected into kind of a longer narrative. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea. Yes. And I'm so excited to have Asali and Andrea in conversation, West Philly natives. We were putting it together sort of backstage earlier that, yes, Andrea has written extensively about Gaydon and Asali about West Philadelphia. So it's such a joy to have you both here. And I'll just turn it over to Asali. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And Also, for people who don't know, and I don't know why you would know this, Andrea Lee and I belong to a canon of two, which is that Black writers writing about a certain prep school on the main line, which is a really funny thing for us to have in common. We've enshrined that certain school in literature.
You have indeed.
And it's funny, we both gave it a different name. And I realize now that your name for it was probably lodged in the back of my brain and probably gave rise to mine. I hadn't read Sarah Phillips in years. And then I was just looking at it and I was like, oh, I spun on your name for it.
It's funny that I'm back in touch with a lot of people from that school right now. And
Yeah.
it's really odd to think of, well, another time we can talk about this over coffee, but people remember things very differently from the way I remember them. So.
Yeah, no doubt there. So I also want to say personally how excited I was about Red Island House, because when I read Brothers and Sisters Around the World, it kind of exploded my head. But it was like, it's a short story. And I think of short stories as like an autobiography of the characters. It's over, And so when I saw the book coming and I saw what it was about, I was just very excited. And there was so much more to mine, in the general sort of material. So I have tons of questions. I'm just going to ask you so the audience can ask questions.
Oh.
But one question I had was thinking about tell me some about the risks and possibilities for writing about Madagascar versus some of the risks and possibilities for writing about Europe, as you've done so extensively before. Tell me about some of your feelings embarking on that project.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm glad you asked me that. I wish it were earlier because I would be more intelligent in talking to you about it. But it's something that was very much on my mind because it's very much in everyone's mind these days, how you go into a culture that's maybe not your own culture and write about it. Because in Europe is, not my culture, but it's certainly closer, especially now after all these years that I've lived here, almost 30 years, than Madagascar is or was. But the thing is that, and I tried for a very long time not to write about Madagascar because I did not think that I had the right to write about a place that is very deep and important and where you really have to, delve and respect the culture. And so, but the fact is that, well, I'll say that a lot of it is based on my own experience because I married my husband who's Italian, and he is an avid diver. So when we got married about, over 20 years, 25 years ago, we began to explore the Indian Ocean. So we stopped at various islands. It's much closer than it sounds because it's quite close to Europe, and it's a kind of a vacation spot for Europeans, the way Hawaii might be for Americans, say, far away, but not that far away, not impossibly far. And so, and since then, we've been back so very many times that, over the years, at least once a year to various places. We have places where we stay. We know lots of people there. So I've had this ongoing encounter with Madagascar that's much more than being a tourist. But it was something that always held me back. We've stayed there, we've lived there. I have many Malagasy friends. I know a lot, but not enough. I never thought I knew enough. But then I began to hear so many stories, but the stories sprang out of a kind of not just Madagascar, but the kind of liminal area between foreigners in Madagascar and Madagascar. Yeah. So there is where I belong, in that area, that in-between area, because there are people who live there who are foreigners, people who are white foreigners, people who are Black foreigners, and people like me who come and go, but I've stayed really a lot of time there. So I realized you can write respectfully about a country if you stay in your, I don't know how to describe it, but you're in between world. And that's what I began to do. And when I wrote that story, that's so interesting, Brothers and Sisters Around the World, which was quite a while ago, I don't think I was in that area yet. I think I was, I look back at it now and I think I'm a little embarrassed by that story, interestingly enough. It's funny because I read it aloud a couple of years ago in Detroit to, I guess it was Mary Marymount College, I've just forgotten, at a conference. I read it to a group of high school students, and I started to feel as if I were being very shallow in discussing the women in that story, because there are two women, they're kind of maybe prostitutes or maybe kind of girls who are, promiscuous, therefore they're, dealing with sexual tourism. And I think I was kind of flippant about them. Whereas when I was reading, I was like, oh my goodness, there's no compassion, no anything, no real understanding here. So I began to feel a little, when I look back at it, I thought, well, I have to go a little deeper. And I think I have in this book. So, it's something, it's just because I know more too. I know so much more because then I hadn't been spending so much time there. So, it's always a very delicate thing though. I feel like I'm an outsider and must be an outsider there, because otherwise, what do you can't tend to be from a country.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, okay. I think also, it's difficult to, there's a certain kind of representative burden of writing about places that haven't been written about exhaustively, and Africa generally, right? Because there's a real chance of the colonializing gaze. Yeah. But I mean, I have to disagree with you about brothers and sisters around the world, because one of the fascinating things about that story, which I think we could also say about this book, is there's this weird way where the main character and it seems like the husband's job was basically to deliver her here where she could be in communion with these other women, right? So, and there you get a sense of this in this book as well, with the relationship between Shay and Bertine Legrand.
Yeah, that's yeah. I think you just realize a great deal of the power of communication between women. It's something they kind of wrote themselves, these stories. So, and they started out as a kind of a group of stories. And then I began to realize there was a thread running through them. They even had different narratives at a certain point. So, and then I began to realize, wait a minute, it has to be Shay. She has to be the link. Besides the house, she has to be the link that holds them together. And then I began to see more and more that there was a lot of communication between women.
So another question I have is, this is travel fiction, right? In some ways, and it could certainly be a literary escape for readers who, don't have second homes in beautiful places. But one of the interesting things about it is that it really lays bare the submerged or sort of hidden political currents of leisure travel and travel writing. And I'm just wondering, how do you approach politics in your writing process? Like, do you sort of make different kinds of calculations, or, I mean, how does it work? How do you think about that when you approach stories?
I think it all comes down to respect. Again, I'm not quite sure how to describe it. I don't think consciously about it, but I know what is right and what I think is right and what I think is wrong. And I think in this story, I don't know, if you've gotten a chance to read the whole book, but I think in this story, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? There's, that is actually, I mean, a lot of the stories are kind of mixed up, are stories that are not necessarily stories that all happen to me. They're bits and pieces as you put together pieces for fiction. But that story actually kind of did happen to me. And, and so I think a lot of the feeling of shame and not, even doubting for a minute that you should respect another Black woman who's in the toils of sexual tourism is, comes through very well. I think it just came through naturally in that story. And I think it just comes through. And then you have to kind of go back and check and see, wait a minute, am I being respectful? Am I being respectful to everyone possible? And I think that's why at the end of the book, for example, I put an author's afterword about Malagasy literature, because I thought there's so much of it, but nobody has read it. I mean, outside of Madagascar, maybe in France and parts of Africa, because it's generally in French or in Malagasy, which is incredibly difficult for me language. And so I thought, here I am, I'm just kind of this visitor or, person who's encountering it. And I'm suddenly writing it and getting attention about writing about Madagascar. It seemed not right to, it seemed not right for me to breeze in and then start to, sort of put Madagascar for Americans, maybe a little bit more on the map, whereas people have been writing for generations. It's a really, really rich literary culture. There are unbelievably beautiful poetry, novels from the 20s and 30s that are just extraordinary and are just being translated now. So, so it's a really delicate feeling. I had a really feeling like I was tiptoeing around, to tell you the truth, and trying to check myself without checking my writing process, because a lot of it,
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
you can't do that. You can't, otherwise you can't write. So
Yeah. And then I think, like, what are some of the books you think about this book? You think this book is in conversation with? I mean, one interesting thing I also wondered about was the conceit to have Shay teach African American literature. I thought that was such a neat device. But what are some of the, things that you feel like this book is sort of talking to or talking back to?
interesting. Well, the books that I read, and I read a lot of that weren't necessarily books or novels, but I did a lot of research for this book that maybe didn't overtly come out into, though some of them do kind of creep out. But I went through every kind of island kind of or between cultures kind of novel or text or short story that I could find, from the French Paul Virginie just to Orinoco, which is the romanticized ideas of of Black people in or island life, or there are all kinds of things I read, but mainly I was reading things about idyllic people's dreams of idyllic life in the tropics, which are generally colonial dreams. It's
Right.
also all very interesting. So you find these everyone had wanted Madagascar. I mean, even Hitler wanted to send Jews to Madagascar instead of to Israel. I mean, everyone wanted a piece of Madagascar. Gauguin, before he went to Polynesia, was really seriously thinking about going to Madagascar. He wrote all these letters to his friends saying, well, Madagascar is really cheap and the women are much nicer than Polynesian women. And they'll give it to you for very little money, and we can live in the jungle and paint pictures. It's really fascinating. So I did a lot of reading about ideas about island paradises, and some particularly about Madagascar. I even read slave annals, Dutch slavers, spent a lot of time around Madagascar. I read a lot of Malagasy literature in translation in French. So there was a lot of reading to it, but a lot of it had to do with this dream that people have of being in paradise and the disastrous things that generally happen to them when they try to live it out. So that always interests me. There's a William S. Burroughs wrote a book. I don't think it's his best book. I don't even think it's a decent book. I've just forgotten the name of it, but one of his very last novellas. What is it called? Ghost of Chance, which is set in Madagascar, which is just kind of dreaming about purity and paradise again. So I went through all of these things and tried to just use them as kind of, I don't know, as a jumping off point for writing Red Island House.
It's so interesting because the sort of anthropological gaze in the novel is not the sort of traditional gaze turned on the people of Madagascar, but it is turned on the white people who turn up in Madagascar and immediately are destroyed. It's like such a careful character study of all these different types of sort of dissolute white people in the tropics, which I thought was like kind of fascinating.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of fun. Well, I know. All right. So this is what it was talking to. I'll tell you this. All right. So when I was that little girl living on Lincoln Avenue in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, I used to be obsessed with old style adventure stories, like, old style, like Kipling's Kim.
Yeah, that's in the book, right? There's a comment about that in the book.
Yeah. So I was obsessed with these stories, loved them, but I always wanted to find a story or to write a story where there would be a hero or heroine much more like me, instead of a white in a pith helmet, So a lot of that, I went back and looked through, I always go back to these stories, and of course I read them with a much more adult gaze now. But I went back and looked through them, and then I just began to play with the whole idea, because part of the idea is that Shay is not just somebody who's looking on, who's joining into some things. She's actually growing, and I didn't understand that, but she's becoming a little bit more aware as the book goes on. As she gets older, she's having her own adventure. She's almost like, it's like sending a Black woman into the traditional landscape of the white adventurer. And so it's in turn kind of inside out. And what does she find? She finds all these kind of monstrosities who are white people. So it's, I guess that, so it is talking a bit to those old adventure stories that I loved so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the other things that's kind of interesting, that's another like sort of unusual thing about the book, and I didn't realize it until I was like deep in the middle of it, is how rare it is for me to actually be reading a like what we would call a literary novel about a rich Black woman. Like that's not really a genre that I mean, it may be romance novels or fantasy or whatever, but it was like kind of striking to me how like I couldn't think of when I had ever done that. And I think it's like part of the, she's an adventurer, but kind of an interesting thing to experience.
Well, that's one of the things she has to explore in herself, that she's kind of,
Yeah.
she's got her life together. She's teaching, she's kind of politically correct. She's raising her kids right. She's, making her parents, that nice couple in Oakland, happy, but she has to kind of come to grips with the fact that she's really privileged. And she's remarkably privileged in that particular country, because that's one of the reasons people go there, because it's such a poor country.
Yeah.
Any guy, any schmo can go there with a little pension and be a millionaire. So, so she's particularly fabulously wealthy, though well-to-do in, other places, but wealthy in Madagascar. And she has to face up to, what does that mean? What does it mean for her? She can't ignore it. She can't pretend to be a tourist. She can't pretend that it doesn't mean anything. So that's part of Shay's kind of journey. She has to figure out things for herself.
One of the things that's interesting, you started by reading from the packet, because like maybe off camera, you can tell me what you think really happened in the story about the ritual, at the end of it, I was like, oh, what?
I will. One day we'll have coffee when I come to Philadelphia, and I'll tell you all the stuff in between the Baldwin stories. We'll have Madagascar stories.
See, you said Baldwin, but I didn't.
Oh, no, Baldwin. James Baldwin. That's what I was saying. James Baldwin is reading the Bunny's Room right now. So
yeah, I mean, I had more questions. I don't know, Emma, if you want to jump in and get the audience in. But one thing I did want to ask is, what's something you want to do in your writing that you haven't done yet? You've written different genres, you've written about a lot of different places. What's something you feel like, okay, I want to get that in there?
I want to go back home into Philadelphia and kind of write about it now. That's what I'm doing with this memoir. It's interesting because it's just like, here I am away, and we all inevitably begin to look at home as a place, as a foreign place almost. I feel incredibly drawn to that little street, that community, and I'm beginning to realize how remarkable it was in a certain way. We don't have time to talk about it now, but there were so many people doing creative things on that particular little neighborhood, historical things, important things, like the guy who did the first Black comic book in the 1940s was just the guy who lived across the street from us, but there were people just up and down the street doing all these things, but they were also just part of our neighborhood. So now I'm so drawn to explore that it seems almost as if I'm drawn to a foreign country. So because I've lived away for so long, you get a different view. You value things more in your past, and so I'm always going back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah. Emma?
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, there are many more questions, and if folks are not super forthcoming in their audience questions, we can always return to have more great discussion. But we do have one question here in the chat for Andrea. It says, does your lexicon or writing style change when writing about characters placed in Madagascar versus if you had placed them in the United States?
Interesting. I think because it's a country that is a francophone country, I kind of insert words, into the text that obviously I wouldn't be using in America. So I insert French words there. I put in a few Malagasy words. I think some of it comes naturally. Some of it is an attempt to kind of give a slight idea of, of the way it is of what it is like to hear this language, or to hear Malagasy language, to hear Malagasy French. So yes, so it does change in that I'm using many more foreign words, I'd say.
Amazing, thank you. And we have one also for both writers that says, thank you so much for this talk. This is great. What do you think growing up in Philadelphia what effect has that had on your writing for both writers?
Okay, Sally, go ahead.
I mean, I don't know that it's had a particular kind of effect on my writing, but it is my writing. So in that way, like, it's kind of inseparable. I mean, everything I write is about Philadelphia, and, I think the kind of very particular kind of Black community I grew up in Philadelphia, like people who are interested in art, people who are Black nationalists, people who are eccentric, like all of those things really. And also, I mean, frankly, like the sort of whiplash that I experienced going on the main line was a big part of I think my formation as a writer in some ways. What about you, Andrea?
Well, I think in some ways, yeah, I think you've said something that's very similar to what I feel about my growing up in Philadelphia. I grew up in Yaden, which was this odd little West Yaden anyway, which is kind of this odd little Black, upper middle class suburb that was very kind of almost to crush together all of these families. And I think I found it a place to leave and to go away from, because I thought it was boring when I lived there. And now, but I've always been drawn to write about it. I mean, look at Sarah Phillips, I write about it a lot when I'm, I kind of, as I just said before, I bounce back and forth between writing about foreign places and about writing about that particular sense of home that I have in the Philadelphia area, which is Yaden's like right outside West Philadelphia. It's just like right there. It's part of West Philadelphia practically. So I don't know. I think it's a wonderful place. I think it's a wonderful place for a writer. I do. I think there was definitely a culture clash when I went to the main line to school, to a private school. And that definitely did, spur me on in some ways to kind of look at myself, to look at life outside of my own world, to feel intense feelings, some painful. So that's not at all bad for a writer, I think. So it's inspiration, but also it's a secure feeling that Philadelphia gives you. It's very interesting. I don't know how to describe it, but I think it's a wonderful city.
So there's a question I don't know if either of you guys can see it. It says, I would love to know more about Andrea Lee's writing and editing process, considering the details within her prose.
Writing and editing process. It's really interesting to know. I don't know. This is a really hard book to write. I have to say. And I mean, this last book was really difficult to write because it started out as short stories and I kind of had to join them together. And it was took a lot of editing and rewriting. In general, I don't know what to say. I try to, I mean, like every other writer, I just sit and, write it all down or write it down on my computer. And then I think it looks terrible. And then I have to rewrite it and try to make it look better. And you just keep going. I don't think you ever want to finish. I mean, I was just looking over this book that I was reading tonight. I thought, oh my God, there's a couple of mistakes that I missed. So it's too late. But so I don't know. I think I just keep going over and over and over and try to follow and trying not to think too much about it, but following a trail. I mean, it's interesting. You try to be conscious and yet unconscious at the same time when you're writing. At least I do.
That's a really great way to put that.
Yeah, it's strange that, and I love your book, by the way, but we'll talk about that another time. I'm loving it. So anyway, but
yeah, go ahead, Asali. You got it.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say there's this other question in the chat. Is there a film in the works for either of you? So I can say on my end, no.
Probably, well, I can't say anything yet, but there's most probably a film in the works.
Yeah.
So can't say anything definite, but there's most probably one. So but we'll know very shortly. So it's quite exciting. So yeah, and I will definitely keep you guys posted. By the way, my brother went to Haverford, so I just wanted to.
Oh, okay.
Haverford College. So yeah, but we have all these things in common. It's funny that so.
Yeah. What year did he graduate about?
Oh, a million years ago.
Well, I mean, I asked specifically because they had, I don't know if you know, but Haverford had a 2-week student strike. And a lot of the things that they were fighting for were things from an original strike that happened in the 70s that had never been addressed. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no. He was at Haverford and my other brother went to Swarthmore. So,
Wow.
we're really, and my son went to Swarthmore. So we have this whole sort of Philadelphia. My son, who grew up in Italy, is, just loves Philadelphia and dreamed of Philadelphia and yearned to go to school in Philadelphia and did. So it's really
Oh, wow.
interesting. There's this link between Europe and Europe and our city.
So a question here is, for both Asali and Andrea, was there someone early in your life who particularly supported and encouraged your writing? Andrea?
I think in general, my family just, was a very reading oriented family. And, they thought it was wonderful whenever I wrote a poem or a story or anything as a really young child. But I have to say that at my school, at both schools, I went to I think it's freezing. I feel like oh no, there you are again. No, at my internet freezing. I had wonderful teachers at both my elementary school and my prep school, or my middle school and high school. So that totally impressed me, totally made it clear to me that you could write as a living, and you could create, and you could work on your creation, you could grow as an artist, as a writer. So it was teachers, but also family.
Yeah, I would say also that, my family, I mean, my sister's a writer, I'm a writer. They don't think that they were stage parents, but like what happened was that both my parents were big readers, but my mom in particular would talk about fiction, particularly by Black women, as if it had happened. And like, so all that, we were on a first name basis with Tony and Alice and all, and so it was like, I remember one day she told me the entire story of their eyes were watching God, as if it had actually happened. And I really think that like, so it wasn't even, something I'll be a writer, but it was like in there, right? So here a question. Did you revise the stories after they were published in the New Yorker, before they appeared as Red Island House?
Interesting. The New Yorker has the most wonderful editing department, I think, that exists. If only they could edit everything. So anything that was edited with the editors of the New Yorker, with Deborah Tressman in general, was so perfect was that I could put it happily into Red Island House, whereas I had to go over with a microscope, go over the other stories that weren't in the New Yorker. So I would think actually the things that are in the books that are in the book, the final version of the book, or those two stories were definitely as they were in the New Yorker. Unless maybe we shortened them a little bit, but I don't think so. So no.
A related question to that is, how long did it take you to work on Red Island House? And talk a little bit more about expanding. I mean, you've talked a little bit about the harrowing, project of weaving the stories into a longer project, but, tell us a little bit more about how you did that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it took a long time to write, because I was not really interested for a while in writing books. I mean, it kind of annoys me that it says, oh, this is her first book in 15 years, like I was, desperately trying to write books. But I was actually much more interested in writing short stories, writing a lot of poetry, which I haven't even tried to publish, or articles. I was doing a lot of journalism. But I had these stories. It was, again, my feelings about Madagascar, because I really felt, so it's such an extraordinary place, but I felt so strongly that maybe it wasn't right for me. Maybe I didn't have the depth or the ability to write correctly and respectfully, keep coming back to respectfully, about Madagascar. But at the same time, these extraordinary anecdotes and incidents just kept piling up in the back of my mind, and I would jot down notes. It's visually the most beautiful place I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it's extraordinarily beautiful. So these sites, I would just jot down notes, and I had just piles of notes, and then I began to kind of weave them into stories. But I think that one thing that happened was that when I was in Madagascar, we went to a pizzeria at some point. This was quite a while ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And we went to a pizzeria, and I saw on this pizzeria had a sign that was a pirate's head, a ridiculous looking sign, a pirate's head, and the name was Libertalia. And I thought, what the heck is Libertalia? And it turned out that there was this legend about Madagascar, that pirates had come from Europe and set up this idyllic, this utopian, in their minds, utopian community in Madagascar, specifically in the north of Madagascar, where we were spending more of our time. And it's a legend, but it's actually a legend that was written down by someone who people think is Daniel Defoe in a pseudonym. And so the story is that these pirates set up their colony and they could do anything they wanted to. That's why it was called Libertalia. And so, of course, they had women and they drank and, did whatever they felt like doing all day long. And the local people, put up with it for a while. And after a while, they just wiped them out. So that's the story of Libertalia. So it began to occur to me that basically that's still kind of going on, even though that may be a legend, but it's a legend that has a lot of truth in it. And it just stuck with me. And I began to look around and I saw in the kind of sex tourists and in kind of neo-colonialism there, I began to see Libertalia kind of all over again. That became kind of a center of my thinking. So that was about, 8 years ago, but I was just like writing stories. And it was only about 3 years ago that I began to really put the stories together. I thought I was going to write a collection, but I was being very kind of slow about it. I had all these stories piled up. And then I began to see that it was not just stories, but a cycle of stories, which is something I'm kind of obsessed with. As I did in Sarah Phillips, I like having stories that make a big story. So I began to weave them together and put Shay in, who's kind of like me, but she's also not me. She's the protagonist, and she became the thread that held them together. So it took I'd say about 3 years, really. And then it was just hard because I'd written it with different, kind of different, I don't know, different times. You had to put the times together, the growth of the children. It was all very complicated, much harder than doing another kind of novel. It was really complicated, exasperating. So, and I had a helper, an assistant, who said, if you give me any more long Malagasy names to correct the spelling on, I'm going to quit, because we kept like misspelling. The names are very long and very intricate and complicated. And I would invariably get one letter wrong, and I'd have to go back and do it. So it was very, very hard work to get it correct. And I feel like I sort of did, but I'm kind of afraid to look at it.
Somebody in the chat asked who your favorite writer is, or maybe you can say a few favorite writers. The writer is a Zora Neale Hurston fan.
That's an interest. Oh, really? Well, I love Zora Neale Hurston, absolutely. And actually, I was just looking and thinking I would love to go back and reread her book, Tell My Horse. Her Haitian book, which is amazing. Yeah, I actually read that at the beginning of doing this writing, just as part of my Black woman going into another kind of a Black culture, which is always fascinating to me. It's hard to find too. So I do love Zora. I like Kane very, very much. It's one of my very favorite books. It's odd. I don't even know what it's about. It's like a mysterious object to me. I read it and I love it, but it's something that I will continue to read and reread. And as for favorite books, it's an interesting question. I like Turgenev and his sportsman sketches because I'm obsessed with short stories. I like Karen Blixen, but only her, not Out of Africa. Her Winter's Tales, which I think are perfection, are just wonderful short stories that hang together. So it's all very eclectic and different. I guess I could say I like Master and Margarita. There's so many different, and then all of James Baldwin. I could just go on. I'm just an insatiable reader, and I go back and read things over and over again.
So wonderful. Thank you so much for this rich conversation. I think a couple folks have hinted at this, but I was wondering if both of you would speak just to what's coming next. I hear both of you have books in the works. So what can we look forward to?
Andrea, go ahead.
Oh, good. No, I already mentioned it. I'm writing a memoir now that's set in Philadelphia. So I'm going from the farthest away place from Philadelphia practically to Philadelphia, to my hometown. And it's called Lincoln Went Down to the Nile, which I kind of love the name because it's actually real. Lincoln is a street and the Nile is a real place. So, and it's really a memoir about that particular time, about that extraordinary place and community. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm hard at work on that now. And when that's up, I'll be back shit. So
So I have a novel coming out called The Days of Afrekete, and that will be out in October. And the way to describe it is that it is a mashup between Sula and Mrs. Dalloway. It's
another favorite book. Okay. Yes, that's wonderful.
So, or I guess if you haven't read either of those books, it's about a middle-aged woman who's throwing a dinner party and spending a lot of time thinking about the love of her life, or the former love of her life, who's across town sort of suffering in these various ways, and who's somebody she met at Bryn Mawr College many years ago. But it's so yeah, that's what that is.
That is wonderful. When it's coming out in September, is that right?
No, it's coming out in October. It's available now for pre-order, they tell me. So
I'm going to order it immediately. Of course, I can hardly wait. Oh my God, two of my favorite books with Sula. I forgot to say. It's amazing when you start talking about books. Oh, that's exciting.
So exciting. Okay, yes, pre-order Asali's forthcoming novel by Andrea Lee's Rhode Island House. All of these books are linked in the chat. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you so much, Asali. It's been such a special eve. If you'd like to continue to get updates from Blue Stoop, you can sign up there in the chat and join us for a virtual round. Folks can feel free to put emojis or words of congratulations for Andrea and Asali in the chat before we depart. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And can I just say, Asali, thank you for a really wonderful conversation. It's so much fun to have people and to have wonderful questions it's just so, I woke up, and it's just so interesting to think about your questions. It's exactly what you hope for when you're having a conversation about your book. Exactly. So thank you.
Well, this was great because I was definitely going to run out and get this book, and I would have had questions, and I got to ask them. So that worked out very well for me.
That was really fun. So thank you so much.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, well, we'll see each other in Philly at some point because I will be back. Probably, I will definitely be in the fall. So So anyway,
get vaccinated and get a glass of wine.
we definitely need to do that. Okay. Accident. It's slower for us. Anyway, thank you so much. So thank you, Mary, and thank you. Thank everybody for coming.
Thank you for coming. What a great night. All right, see you soon.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful visiting Philly tonight. It really was.
Great appreciation.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Good night.